pragmatic approach to promoting mental health and well-being at work. I'm beginning to see a pattern. The words systems and proactive are coming up.
Thanks, Matt. Research in most multicultural airlines shows that the Australian accent is the most difficult for pilots to understand in the flight deck. So being Australian, if I'm speaking too fast and you need me to slow down, just give me a wave. Okay, so I recently visited my nephews in Australia. They're 8 and 10 years old. And it struck me how aware they were of their health. So they had a healthy eating poster on the refrigerator door, and they pointed out to me which foods were healthy and which foods I should avoid. They also were very aware of proactive and preventative health measures, so things like exercise, brushing their teeth regularly, wearing sunscreen and hats when they go outdoors. So while I was there, I cut and bruised my foot, and the 8-year-old was able to say to me, I think you should put a Band-Aid on it and maybe some ice. So we're all very well aware, even from quite a young age, of physical health and well-being and proactive strategies for managing our physical health. But can we say the same about mental health? We also discuss physical injuries quite openly, and a lot of people post their injuries on Facebook. But again, when it comes to psychological injuries, we don't speak so openly about them. People often don't know what to do or how to approach somebody with a psychological injury or illness. They might even say something unhelpful like, lighten up, chin up, put a smile on your face, or it's all in your head, just shake it off. But would we say to somebody with a broken leg, it's all in your leg, just shake it off? So we need to think about how we approach psychological injuries and illness. There was a recent UK survey that found that 20% of people actually believed that mental health and mental illness was a result of lack of self-discipline or lack of self-control, which of course we know is not the case. So I first started working on this topic in the rail industry a number of years ago. And Forbes mentioned earlier suicide on the rail tracks. So we actually had a rate of at least 1 fatality on the tracks every month. So this was either as a result of accidental deaths, where people were crossing the tracks and struck by a train, or a result of suicide. So this exposed our drivers and other safety critical staff to risk of post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health conditions. And similar to what Robert mentioned earlier, drivers did share the view that alcohol was the best treatment for trauma. So what we did was put in place quite a comprehensive program for the prevention and management of trauma amongst trained drivers and other safety critical personnel. There were some drivers I knew who had as many as 7 or 8 fatalities in their career. Others managed to go through their career without experiencing any. I'll draw on some of this rail industry work later in the presentation, and really the presentation will echo a lot of the themes we've already heard today. But I guess what I can add is that a number of these initiatives have been applied for many years in other industries and do work effectively. So there's a lot of stuff out there that we can just pick up and apply relatively easily within aviation. So we've already seen some definitions of health and mental health today, so I won't go through those again. But the point I'd like to draw from these definitions is that managing mental health is not about screening to identify people with mental health conditions, but it's about proactively creating work environments that both support positive well-being and help pilots in dealing with day-to-day work and life stresses. So earlier we heard about tip of the iceberg events. I've lost my percentages on a couple of those items there. So the item that I've labelled deliberate pilot intent, so where we're talking about pilot suicides, in the context of all fatal accidents worldwide represents less than 1%. So purely looking in terms of risk, compared with things like loss of control in flight, runway-related accidents, and CFIT, this particular risk is really, really tiny. But having said that, there is a lot that we can and should do to promote health and well-being amongst pilots. So this is really not about preventing events like Germanwings, but it's about providing positive environments where we can support mental health for pilots. We've already seen a number of statistics this morning, so I won't spend a lot of time on these. But data across the UK, Europe and Australia is all fairly consistent. We typically see that 1 in 4 people are likely to have experienced some kind of mental health issue in the last year. 1 in 4 people are likely to experience anxiety at some point in their lifetime. Around 1 in 6 likely to experience depression at some point in their lifetime. And 45% of people will experience some kind of mental illness at some point in their lifetime, which is nearly half the room. So we do spend a lot of our waking hours in the workplace, and it's been acknowledged that the workplace can contribute to the development of mental health conditions, but the workplace can also play quite a significant role in preventing mental health conditions. And you can see on the graph here, in the past 10 years, the amount of research on workplace mental health has significantly increased. Some European health and safety research looking at data over the past 15 years found that around 50 to 60% of all lost working days were related to work-related stress. Mental health problems are now the second leading cause of lost time or work-related illness, second to musculoskeletal injuries, and many of those can be traced back to work stress as well. So, as well as the personal cost to individuals, there is a significant cost to organisations when it comes to mental health issues that are untreated in the workplace. So, what can we do about it? There is an established link between work stresses and conditions such as anxiety and depression. So the workplace can play an important role in preventing mental health conditions. And we define a mentally healthy workplace as one that promotes mental health and empowers people to seek help. There was a survey of Australian employees that found that 1 in 5 people had taken time off work in the previous 12 months because they felt stressed, anxious, depressed, or otherwise mentally unhealthy. What's interesting though is the rate was 46% higher in people who rated their workplace as mentally unhealthy compared with those who rated their workplace as being mentally healthy. So there are 3 main things that we can focus on in managing, promoting well-being within the workplace. The first one is prevention. So this is about reducing work-related stress and identifying and managing the hazards that are likely to lead to work-related stress. The second one is identification, and this is not about screening to identify people with mental health conditions, but this is about identifying the less serious and easily treatable mental health concerns and proactively managing them. We can equip people to be more aware of mental health concerns and to identify mental health concerns in themselves and others. And we need to build a culture of open reporting. And this relies upon reducing stigma and career jeopardy. So if a pilot fears for their career, then they simply won't report a mental health concern. And if we don't know about mental health concerns, then we can't manage the risk. The third thing, and most importantly, is that we can provide support. And I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. So let's first of all look at the proactive management of hazards. So we refer to conditions within the workplace that can impact negatively on mental health as psychosocial risks. So this is very much the risk management approach that Roxanne just mentioned a little while ago. So psychosocial risks can be managed in a similar way to any other risks. We identify hazards, we assess the level of risk associated with those hazards, we implement control measures, and we monitor and review. So we already have the structures in place within most airlines through our safety management systems to be able to do this. We already have risk management processes that we use for flight safety risk, for personal safety risk, and so on. And one thing we did within the rail organisation was to take all of the different work groups and conduct formal risk assessments to identify the psychosocial risks relevant to different work groups. And these can differ. So, for example, in a maintenance environment, the psychosocial hazards might be more related to night work and difficult shift patterns, perhaps bullying and harassment. Whereas in our customer-facing people, we were more prone to seeing customer or passenger-initiated violence. So the psychosocial hazards can be very different in different work areas. To put it in very simple terms, psychosocial risk is typically the combination of high job demands and low job control, and generally low social support. And we've heard a fair bit about support already today as a very protective measure in the workplace. So let's have a look at some of these hazards in a little bit more detail. This is a generic list of hazards, but you'll see that many of these do apply to the role of a pilot. So the first category of hazard is demand, or job demand. So here we're talking about things like excessively high or low workload, the pace of work, shift work, schedules and rosters. So night work, rotating shift patterns, for example, are associated with higher levels of stress. Equipment, inadequate equipment and tools, harsh physical environments, so excessive temperatures, extremes of temperature, noise, vibration, and so on. And the work-home interface. The work-home interface is one that particularly stands out for pilots as being quite a psychosocial hazard, particularly when people are away from home for extended periods. Also, in the inability to switch off when you are away from the job. So on layovers, typically pilots are in airport hotels, close to the airport, seeing and hearing aircraft. So the ability to psychologically switch off from the job is quite difficult. The next category is control. So this refers to the amount of control somebody has over their job and how it's carried out. So this is control over decision making, control over how work is conducted, the amount of influence people have on their schedule, the opportunity to develop skills, and unnecessary levels of surveillance. So control of work, I think, is an interesting one for pilots as well. Many airlines are so highly proceduralised that pilots now have very little control over how they carry out their work and very little opportunity to use their judgment. So I think that's a hazard that is somewhat prevalent within the pilot's role. Unnecessary surveillance. Pilots are subject to high levels of surveillance. Whether we call it unnecessary or not is another thing, but there's line checks, SIM checks, medical checks, flight data monitoring, and so on. They're one of the most highly surveilled roles that I can think of. Another category is relationships. So quality of interpersonal relationships, things like conflict, harassment, bullying, and the concept of organisational justice. So low organisational justice can be a psychosocial hazard. And what we mean by this is the extent to which people are treated fairly. So this has a direct link with just culture policies, for example. There's also hazards associated with the design of a role. So roles that are unclear, ambiguous, that lack variety, fragmented or meaningless work, and inadequate use of someone's skills can all be psychosocial hazards. And what I'll pick out there is variety. So repetitive short sector flying, for example, could be considered a psychosocial risk because of the lack of variety. And similar things can occur in long-haul flying if there are very few routes on a particular aircraft type. And finally, organisational change. And I don't think there's an airline in the world that's not undergoing significant change a lot of the time. So change in itself can be a major psychosocial hazard. The extent to which the organisation communicates with their people, lack of consultation, lack of awareness for people about how that change might impact on them personally, and of course job insecurity. And having previously worked in a large airline that was going through a significant downsizing, I did personally see the effects of change and lack of communication and consultation on the well-being of personnel. So this was everything from stress and lost productivity through to a number of suicides that occurred within the airline during that period of time. So change is often underestimated but has an enormous impact. So it is possible to modify and manage a number of these hazards. And airline policies such as just culture, fatigue risk management, the way we manage change, are all things that can reduce psychosocial risk. But one of the most effective things that we can do is provide support. So support acts as a buffer against these other hazards and stresses, and also helps people deal with these stresses and build resilience. So even though the workplace can be a source of psychosocial risk, it can also be a valuable source of support. And providing support is really quite simple. It's about things like feedback, encouragement, giving practical support, people being able to talk to their supervisors or peers about issues, and receiving understanding and empathy. So they're things that we can all do. Providing supervisor support is quite challenging in a lot of airlines because typically there are large groups of pilots reporting to a single fleet manager. And this makes it really difficult for the managers to have any day-to-day, face-to-face contact with the pilots who work for them. And this is something that we tackled within the rail operator because we had a similar problem, effectively 800 pilots reporting to one line manager. It's impossible for that line manager to know their people and engage with them. So what we did was created small groups of drivers who were allocated a senior driver, and that senior driver was someone who could provide face-to-face communication about organisational changes. And I know as pilots, your inbox fills up with hundreds of organisational communications and no one reads them. It was the same in the rail industry. Drivers didn't read the organisational communications. But having these senior drivers out there able to talk to people face to face was an effective way of communicating important information. It also gave drivers a regular day-to-day point of contact, so for questions, concerns, and it also meant that the senior driver was able to notice when someone was having difficulties, when perhaps they weren't quite themselves. So it provided multiple benefits in having these senior drivers allocated to groups of drivers. It didn't take away the manager's responsibility for managing their people and managing performance, but it provided a face-to-face communication mechanism. So drawing on some of the programs that we put in place, specifically around support, we made sure that all managers and supervisors had formal leadership training. And what we found within the rail industry, and it's the same in a lot of airlines, was that people are typically promoted from technical roles to management positions with no formal leadership training. And so drivers would become managers, become responsible for people, but had no training in how to transition into that role. And we do see the same within airlines. So everyone received formal leadership training. We also raised awareness about mental health. We incorporated mental health as a component of fitness for duty. So fitness for duty included medical and physical fitness, alcohol and drugs, fatigue, stress, and mental health. So drivers were encouraged to self-report when they felt that stressful events or difficult periods of time for them were impacting their ability to operate safely online. So when they came forward, they could be offered leave or alternative duties back in the office or in another less safety critical environment for the period of time that they needed before returning to line. And we did find that many drivers did come forward. So similar to pilots, there's a certain level of infallibility amongst drivers. It's particularly in the Australian train driving environment, it's a very macho culture. People don't want to be seen to be weak, and they see stress as a sign of weakness. So it took some time to get people to be willing and comfortable to come forward, but it did happen, and it can be done. We also had a formal peer support program where drivers were specially selected and trained to provide support, particularly after a traumatic event such as a fatality, but also after a serious operational incident. And these peer support drivers were also available to accompany the driver on their first couple of shifts back So if they felt they just wanted somebody riding in the cab with them on the observer seat for a couple of shifts, the trauma support drivers, or the peer support drivers as they became known, were able to do that. We also had formal case management and return to work programs, and this was particularly for people who needed time away from work and perhaps some treatment, also those who had compensation claims that needed to be processed. And so people in the office that looked after rehabilitation of physical injuries were also allocated the role of case managing people who needed referrals and treatment for mental health conditions. And in this case also they were able to find suitable alternative duties for people who couldn't immediately return to line. We did have a formal employee assistance program, but generally a lot of drivers felt that the counsellors didn't really understand the demands of the role of a driver. They didn't understand what it was like to be a driver. So I guess there's a couple of things we can take from that. One is that we really should be putting our counsellors out there to have a look at the role of people they're counselling, provide them education about the role, the demands and the stresses associated with the role. But most importantly, because the drivers were more likely to talk to their peers, we need to provide peers with the skills to be able to provide support. So we introduced a program of mental health first aid training, and again we've heard a little bit about mental health first aid already this morning. But I'm proud to say Australia did invent mental health first aid. Forbes mentioned that earlier.
2003.
That's right. So mental health first aid essentially was designed to improve mental health literacy. It's typically delivered through training programs, and the training programs aim at increasing knowledge and awareness of mental health conditions, reducing negative attitudes and stigma, as well as giving people practical skills that they can use in supporting somebody with a mental health condition. So some of the benefits of mental health first aid: raising awareness and recognition, reducing stereotyping, stigma, discrimination, providing skills in supporting people, promoting good mental health and decreasing the time taken to access treatment. So one of the things that we know is that people are less likely to seek treatment in the early stages of a mental health condition. But it's at that point that treatment can be most effective. So peer referrals can be much more effective at getting somebody to treatment because people are more likely to seek treatment if someone within their social network has suggested it. So in summary, what we can do within the workplace is to proactively manage hazards, make sure that people are not exposed to levels of work stress that may lead to or even exacerbate a mental health condition. We can create an environment where pilots are comfortable and willing to self-report, and most importantly, provide a range of different support options, including formal assistance programs, manager training, peer support, and other initiatives like mental health first aid. And I do look forward to a future when it does feel just as natural for us to apply mental health first aid as it does to put a band-aid on a